The ornate church was awash in golden afternoon light, streaming through stained glass windows and casting prismatic patterns across the white runner that stretched down the aisle. Floral arrangements of white roses and baby's breath adorned every pew, their sweet fragrance mingling with the scent of burning candles. The church, normally quiet and contemplative, buzzed with the excited whispers of 200 guests dressed in their finest attire. In a small anteroom, Pastor James Mitchell adjusted his clerical collar for the third time, a habit he developed over 30 years of ministry. At 62, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that had witnessed countless joys and sorrows, he had officiated more weddings than he could count. Yet something felt different today. "Everything okay, Pastor?" asked the young deacon, helping him prepare. "Yes, of course," James replied, though the slight furrow in his brow suggested otherwise. "Just making sure everything is perfect for Emily's big day." Emily Stevens had been a fixture in his congregation since she was a little girl. He'd watched her grow from a shy child hiding behind her mother's skirt to the confident, compassionate woman she'd become. Today she was marrying Adam Wells, a man who had appeared in her life and their church just 8 months ago. As the organist began the prelude, Pastor James made his way to the altar. He smiled at Adam, who stood tall and handsome in his tailored black tuxedo, a nervous smile playing on his lips. The groomsmen lined up beside him, adjusting cufflinks and straightening ties. Pastor James had always prided himself on his ability to read people, a skill honed through decades of counseling and ministry. Something about Adam's demeanor today struck him as odd attention beyond normal wedding jitters, a vigilance in his eyes as he scanned the gathering crowd. The music shifted, signaling the procession was about to begin. Bridesmaids in lavender dresses glided down the aisle, followed by Emily's niece scattering rose petals. Then, as the wedding march began, the congregation rose to their feet. Emily appeared at the entrance, radiant in her ivory gown, her father proudly at her side. As she made her way toward the altar, Pastor James glanced at Adam again. The groom's face had drained of color as his eyes fixed on someone in the back of the church. Following Adam's gaze, Pastor James spotted an older gentleman he didn't recognize, who seemed equally shocked to see the groom. In that moment, a distant memory stirred in the pastor's mind, a face from years ago, a tragic story from another town, a newspaper article he'd read. His heart began to race as pieces fell into place. He looked again at Adam, whose eyes now met his with a flash of recognition and fear. Pastor James knew then that he couldn't let the ceremony continue, not until he confirmed what he suddenly suspected. The truth needed to come to light, even if it meant stopping a wedding already in progress. Emily Stevens had always been a believer in fairy tales, not the kind with magical creatures or enchanted forests, but the kind where good people find happiness after enduring hardship. At 32, she had weathered her share of storms. Her mother's early death from cancer had forced her to become the woman of the house at just 15, caring for her grieving father and younger brother, while classmates worried about prom dates and college applications. Romance had always taken a back seat to responsibility. Through college and into her career as a pediatric nurse, Emily focused on caring for others. She'd had relationships, of course a college boyfriend who wanted different things, a doctor who couldn't commit, a musician whose lifestyle didn't mesh with hers. Each ending had hurt, but Emily remained optimistic. "You have too much love to give," her best friend Melissa often told her. "The right person just hasn't been ready for it yet." On a rainy Tuesday 9 months ago, that all changed. Emily was leaving the hospital after a particularly difficult shift when she noticed a man helping an elderly woman with a flat tire in the parking lot. Despite the downpour, he worked diligently, shielding the woman with his umbrella while getting soaked himself. When he finished, refusing the woman's offer of payment, Emily approached him. "That was really kind of you," she said, offering him her own umbrella. Adam Wells looked up, rainwater dripping from his dark hair, and smiled. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. The parking lot had been full of people hurrying past. Coffee turned into dinner, which became movie nights and weekend hikes. Adam was attentive, intelligent, and seemed to understand Emily in ways no one else had. He worked remotely as a software consultant, which gave him a flexible schedule that complemented her demanding hospital shifts. When Emily brought Adam to church for the first time, Pastor James had welcomed him warmly. Adam quickly became involved in the congregation, volunteering for community outreach programs and attending Bible study. Emily's father, initially protective and skeptical, grew to appreciate Adam's respectful nature and obvious devotion to his daughter. 3 months into their relationship, during a weekend trip to the mountains, Adam proposed under a canopy of stars. Emily hadn't hesitated. In Adam, she believed she'd found someone who valued compassion and kindness as much as she did, someone who would build a life of service and love alongside her. As the wedding date approached, Emily found herself reflecting on her journey. Her bridesmaids threw her a sweet shower where they shared stories and advice. Her father gave her mother's pearl earrings to wear on the big day. Even her brother Tom, who rarely showed emotion, had teared up when she showed him her dress. "Mom would be so proud of you," he'd said, hugging her tightly. The night before the wedding, Emily couldn't sleep. She wasn't having doubts, quite the opposite. For the first time in her life, everything felt right. She was marrying a good man surrounded by people she loved. As dawn broke on her wedding day, Emily watched the sunrise from her childhood bedroom window and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Hours later, as her father walked her down the aisle, Emily's eyes were fixed on Adam. She barely noticed the packed church, the beautiful decorations, or the music. All she could see was her future husband, the man who had promised to stand by her side through whatever life brought their way. She couldn't have known that the biggest test of that promise was about to begin. Adam Wells had arrived in Mapleton 9 months ago with nothing but 2 suitcases and a rental car reservation. He'd chosen a mid-sized city for its distance from his past, far enough to start fresh, but not so far as to raise eyebrows. His first week was spent in a modest hotel, while he secured a furnished apartment downtown, paying 6 months' rent in advance with cash. What the people of Mapleton, including Emily, didn't know was that Adam Wells wasn't his real name. Before coming to town, he had been Michael Reeves, a financial advisor from Seattle with a promising career and a life that had fallen apart 3 years earlier. The transformation hadn't been easy. New identification, a carefully constructed backstory, and vigilant attention to detail had been necessary. He'd grown a beard, changed his hairstyle, and adopted a slightly different manner of speaking. The remote work story wasn't entirely false. He did work as a consultant, though under his new identity and for clients who never met him in person. When he met Emily, Adam had intended only to help an elderly woman with her car. He hadn't planned on making connections in Mapleton. In fact, he deliberately avoided them. But something about Emily's genuine warmth had cracked the carefully constructed wall around his heart. Against his better judgment, he'd accepted her coffee invitation. One coffee became many. As weeks passed, Adam found himself increasingly drawn to Emily's compassionate nature and her unwavering optimism. She made him want to be the person he was pretending to be, someone worthy of her trust and love. For the first time in years, he began to hope for a future different from the lonely existence he'd resigned himself to. The decision to propose hadn't been impulsive. Adam had agonized over it for weeks, wrestling with his conscience. Could he build a life with Emily based on a foundation of lies? But the alternative, losing her, had become unthinkable. He convinced himself that Michael Reeves was a person who no longer existed, that Adam Wells was who he truly was now. Emily's friends and family had various impressions of Adam. Her father, Robert Stevens, appreciated Adam's respectful demeanor, but occasionally commented that he seemed reluctant to talk about his past. Melissa, Emily's best friend and maid of honor, admired how attentive Adam was to Emily, but found it odd that he had no old friends attending the wedding. Only colleagues he'd met since moving to Mapleton. "Don't you think it's weird that he never talks about his family?" she'd asked Emily once. "He told me about losing his parents young and growing up in foster care," Emily had replied. "It's painful for him to discuss." This was the story Adam had shared orphaned as a teen, bounced between foster homes, working his way through college on scholarships and determination. It explained his lack of family connections and his reluctance to discuss his past. Emily's compassionate heart had been moved by this narrative of overcoming adversity, never suspecting it was carefully crafted to avoid the truth. As the wedding day approached, Adam's anxiety grew. He loved Emily, that wasn't a lie. He wanted to build a life with her. That wasn't a lie either. But everything that had brought him to this point was built on deception. Still, he convinced himself that the past could remain buried, that his new life could continue without the old one intruding. On the morning of the wedding, Adam stood before the mirror in his tuxedo, hardly recognizing himself, not because of the formal attire, but because for a moment he glimpsed Michael Reeves looking back at him, the man he'd been before everything changed. "Today I marry Emily," he whispered to his reflection. "Today Adam Wells becomes real." But as he would soon discover, the past is never as buried as we hope it to be. Dawn broke clear and bright on the first Saturday in May, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. The church grounds bustled with activity. By 8 o'clock, florists arranging last-minute bouquets, caterers preparing for the reception in the adjacent hall, photographers scouting the best locations for pictures. At her parents' home, Emily sat patiently as her sister-in-law styled her hair into an elegant updo, adorned with tiny pearl pins that matched her mother's earrings. The bridal suite was a flurry of activity, bridesmaids helping each other with zippers and clasps, Melissa keeping everyone on schedule, Emily's aunt dabbing away tears every few minutes. "You're the calmest bride I've ever seen," marveled the makeup artist as she applied a touch of blush to Emily's cheeks. Emily smiled. "I've waited my whole life for this day. Why be nervous about something so right?" Across town in his apartment, Adam wasn't experiencing the same serenity. He'd barely slept, plagued by dreams of his past catching up to him. The morning brought no relief as he mechanically went through the motions of showering and dressing. His best man, a colleague from work named David, mistook his silence for pre-wedding jitters. "Cold feet, buddy," David joked, helping Adam with his bow tie. "No," Adam replied firmly. "No second thoughts. Just want everything to be perfect." Perfect meant no surprises, no unexpected faces from the past, nothing to disturb the new life he'd built. Adam had been careful, so careful, for 3 years. Yet as the hour approached, an inexplicable dread settled in his stomach. By noon, guests began arriving at the church. Emily's extended family had traveled from across the country, aunts, uncles, and cousins she saw only at major life events. Friends from her childhood, college roommates, colleagues from the hospital all came to witness her marry the man they believed was perfect for her. Inside the church vestibule, Pastor James greeted guests warmly, noting how many people's lives Emily had touched. When Adam arrived with his groomsmen, the pastor observed his tense posture, but attributed it to normal wedding day stress. After all, despite the relatively short courtship, he had no reason to doubt the young man's intentions toward Emily. In the bride's room, Emily stood before a full-length mirror as Melissa fastened the last button on her gown. The dress was classic, a fitted lace bodice flowing into a simple satin skirt, elegant and timeless, just like Emily herself. Her father knocked gently before entering, stopping short at the sight of his daughter. "Oh, Em," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You look just like your mother on our wedding day." Emily crossed the room and embraced him. "She's here with us today, Dad. I can feel it." Robert Stevens cleared his throat. "I'm supposed to give you some fatherly advice about marriage, but honestly, sweetheart, you've always had better judgment than most people twice your age. All I can say is that I believe you've chosen someone who sees how special you are, and that's all a father can ask for." As the clock struck 2, the church was filled capacity. The organist began playing soft preludes as the final guests found their seats. In the anteroom, Pastor James reviewed his notes one last time, including the personal message he prepared for the couple. Adam and his groomsmen took their places at the altar, each adjusting ties and cuffs in nervous anticipation. Through the side door of the church, an older man slipped in quietly and took a seat in the back row. He wasn't on the guest list and knew no one would recognize him, no one except the groom. He hadn't planned to come, had debated with himself for weeks after seeing the engagement announcement in the newspaper. But in the end, he couldn't stay away. He needed to see for himself. The music changed, signaling the start of the procession. As the bridesmaids made their way down the aisle one by one, Adam scanned the crowd, a habit he'd never quite broken. His confident smile faltered only for a second when his eyes reached the back row, but it was long enough for Pastor James to notice. The wedding march began and the congregation rose. Emily appeared at the entrance on her father's arm, radiant with joy and completely unaware that her perfect day was about to take an unexpected turn. The church fell silent as Emily and her father began their walk down the aisle. Each step was measured, dignified, marking the transition from one chapter of life to another. Guests smiled and whispered admiring comments as she passed. Some dabbed at tears. Others captured the moment on their phones despite the unplugged ceremony, requests in the program. Emily's gaze remained fixed on Adam. The nervous tension she'd noticed earlier seemed to have melted away, replaced by a look of such profound love that it made her heart swell. This was the moment she dreamed of walking toward her future, surrounded by loved ones, about to commit herself to the man who understood her like no one else. At the altar, Robert Stevens placed Emily's hand in Adam's, a gesture as old as marriage itself, and took his seat beside his son in the front row. Pastor James smiled at the couple before addressing the congregation. "Dearly beloved," he began, his resonant voice filling the church, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to witness the joining of Emily Stevens and Adam Wells in holy matrimony." As Pastor James continued with the traditional opening of the ceremony, he couldn't help but notice Adam's eyes occasionally darting toward the back of the church. Following his gaze, the pastor again noticed the older gentleman who had slipped in just before the procession. There was something familiar about him, though Pastor James couldn't quite place it. "Marriage," the pastor continued, "is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently and soberly. Into this holy estate, these two persons present come now to be joined." He turned the page of his well-worn prayer book, moving into the section where he would ask if anyone had cause why the couple should not be joined. It was a formality in his 30 years as a minister. No one had ever actually objected during this portion of the ceremony. Yet today, an uneasy feeling crept over him as he prepared to recite the words. "If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, speak now or forever hold your peace." The customary silence followed, stretching perhaps a second or two longer than usual. Pastor James was about to continue when something clicked in his memory, a connection between the strange in the back and the nervous groom before him. 3 years ago, he had attended a ministerial conference in Seattle. During one of the social events, he'd overheard other pastors discussing a tragic situation involving one of their church members, a young financial advisor named Michael Reeves. The story had stuck with him because of its heartbreaking nature. A promising young man who had lost everything when his fiancée died in a car accident for which some blamed him, though he was cleared of wrongdoing. The man had disappeared shortly after, unable to bear the whispers and accusations. Pastor James glanced again at the man in the back row, older, grayer, but unmistakably the father of Michael's deceased fiancée. Then he looked at Adam, really looked at him, past the beard and different hairstyle. The resemblance to the photograph he'd seen in the newspaper article about the accident was striking once you knew to look for it. His heart began to race. Could Adam Wells actually be Michael Reeves? If so, what did that mean for Emily? Was she marrying a man with a false identity? Did she know? Pastor James had always taken his role as a spiritual guide seriously. The vows about to be exchanged were sacred promises made before God. Could he, in good conscience, continue the ceremony without being certain that both parties were entering into it honestly? Emily, noticing the pastor's prolonged pause, gave him a questioning look. Adam's face had grown increasingly pale, his eyes pleading silently with the pastor to continue, to say nothing. The congregation began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Robert Stevens leaned forward slightly, confusion evident on his face. Melissa exchanged glances with the other bridesmaids. Pastor James cleared his throat and made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. "Before we proceed," he said quietly, addressing the couple, "I need to speak with both of you privately." Immediately, a murmur rippled through the congregation. This was not part of the ceremony they had expected to witness. Pastor James led Emily and Adam to his office adjacent to the church sanctuary, closing the door behind them. Through the wood, they could hear the confused murmurs of the guests. "What's happening, Pastor?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" The pastor gestured for them to sit in the 2 chairs facing his desk. He remained standing, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Adam," he said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He paused, meeting the younger man's eyes directly. "Are you Michael Reeves from Seattle?" The color drained from Adam's face. His hands, which had been loosely clasped in his lap, tightened until the knuckles turned white. Emily looked between them, confusion evident in her expression. "Who is Michael Reeves?" she asked. "Adam, what is he talking about?" Pastor James watched Adam carefully. In that moment of shocked silence, he knew his suspicion was correct. The question now was whether to proceed gently or confront the situation head-on. Years of counseling experience had taught him that moments like these required both truth and compassion. "I believe the man sitting in the back row of the church is the father of a young woman named Cassandra Bennett," Pastor James said quietly. "She died in a car accident 3 years ago in Seattle. Her fiancé at the time was a financial advisor named Michael Reeves." Adam closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. When he opened them, he looked not at the pastor, but at Emily. "I was going to tell you," he whispered, "after the wedding, when we were away together. I was going to tell you everything." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "Tell me what?" "Adam, what is going on?" "My name isn't Adam Wells," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "It's Michael Reeves. I changed my identity after the accident, after Cassie died." Pastor James sank into his chair behind the desk, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. As a minister, he had counseled countless people through difficult situations, but this was unprecedented in his experience. A marriage ceremony halted because the groom was living under a false identity. It would have seemed like the plot of a film if it weren't unfolding before his eyes. "Why?" Emily's voice broke on the single word, tears welling in her eyes. "Why would you lie about who you are?" Adam or Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Because I couldn't be Michael anymore," he said. "Everyone in Seattle blamed me for the accident, even though the police cleared me. Cassie's parents, our friends, even some of my clients, they all looked at me like I was responsible for her death." "What happened?" Pastor James asked gently. Michael took a deep breath. "We were driving home from a dinner party. It was raining. A truck ran a red light and hit us on the passenger side. Cassie died instantly." His voice caught. "I walked away with a few scratches. Some people thought I'd been drinking, but I wasn't. The tests proved it. Still, the whispers started that I'd been arguing with her, that I was distracted, that somehow I could have prevented it." Emily sat very still, tears streaming down her face. "So you ran away. You invented a new person." "I tried to stay," Michael insisted. "For 6 months, I tried. But everywhere I went, I saw accusation in people's eyes. I lost clients. Friends stopped calling. Cassie's father threatened me at the funeral." He glanced toward the door, indicating the church beyond. "That's him out there, Robert Bennett." Pastor James considered his responsibility in this moment. 200 guests were waiting. A bride was learning her groom had concealed his true identity, and somewhere in the mix was a grieving father whose presence had triggered this revelation. "Emily," the pastor said gently, "did you know anything about this?" She shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. "I never lied about who I am," Michael said desperately. "Just my name and some details about my past. Everything between us is real. Emily, how I feel about you, what we built together, none of that is a lie." Pastor James leaned forward. "Michael, I understand you've been through a terrible tragedy, but building a marriage on deception is dangerous ground. Emily deserved to know who she was committing her life to." "I know," Michael admitted, hanging his head. "I convinced myself that Adam Wells was real now, that Michael Reeves no longer existed. But seeing Robert today, it all came rushing back." The pastor turned Emily, whose shocked expression had hardened into something more resolute. "Emily, I know this is overwhelming. What do you want to do?" She straightened her shoulders, the same strength that had carried her through her mother's death and other life challenges visibly asserting itself. "I want to understand," she said simply. "Before I make any decisions, I need to know everything." Pastor James nodded. "We need to address the guests. They've been waiting for nearly 15 minutes. "Tell them there's been a delay," Emily said with unexpected calmness. "And I think Mr. Bennett should join us." Michael's head snapped up. Emily, no. Yes, she said firmly. If I'm going to understand, I need to hear both sides. The pastor recognized the wisdom in her approach, even as he worried about the emotional volatility of bringing Robert Bennett into the conversation. Still, Emily was right. The full truth needed to emerge before anyone could move forward. I'll speak to the guests and ask Mr. Bennett to join us, Pastor James said, rising from his chair. Take a few moments to collect yourselves. As he left the office, the pastor's mind raced with concern for all involved. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: his decision to stop the ceremony had been the right one, painful as the consequences might be. Pastor James returned 5 minutes later with Robert Bennett, a stocky man in his 60s with a weathered face and eyes that held both grief and anger. The atmosphere in the small office crackled with tension. You, Robert said, his voice trembling as he looked at Michael. Of all the contemptible things you've done, this might be the worst. A new name, a new life, as if my daughter never existed. Michael stood, his posture defensive but his eyes remorseful. Mr. Bennett, I never intended. To get caught? Robert interrupted bitterly. To have your charade exposed. Emily rose from her chair, her wedding dress rustling. Despite her tear-stained face, she carried herself with dignity. Mr. Bennett, I'm Emily Stevens. I'm sorry about your daughter. Robert's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. You seem like a nice young woman. You deserve better than be pulled into his web of lies. That's why we're here, Emily said calmly, though her hands trembled. I want to understand what happened. The full truth, not just one perspective. Pastor James gestured for everyone to sit. We need to have this conversation with respect and honesty, he said firmly. 200 people are waiting in the sanctuary, many of them confused and concerned. We owe it to them and to ourselves to resolve this with integrity. Robert sat at the edge of his chair, as if ready to flee at any moment. What do you want to know? He asked Emily. Everything, she replied. How did you find out about our wedding? Why come today? The older man sighed heavily. I saw your engagement announcement in the newspaper. A friend from Mapleton sent it to me, thinking I might know the groom from his business circles. The moment I saw his face, he shook his head. I had to be sure. I had to see if it was really him. And what did you plan to do? Pastor James asked. I don't know, Robert admitted. Part of me wanted to stand up during that speak now or forever hold your peace moment. But another part just needed to see him to confirm that while my daughter lies in her grave, he's moving on as if she never existed. Michael leaned forward intensely. I have never forgotten Cassie. Not for a single day. Then why the new identity? Emily asked, her voice steadier now. Why not tell me about your past? Michael looked at her pleadingly. Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd look at me the way everyone in Seattle did, like I was responsible somehow. And later, when I fell in love with you, I was afraid of losing you. You told me you had no family, Emily said, that you grew up in foster care. My parents disowned me after the accident, Michael replied. They loved Cassie. Everyone did. When she died, they couldn't bear to look at me. It felt like I had no family. Robert's jaw tightened. You got behind the wheel that night. The truck ran a red light, Michael countered, frustration evident in his voice. The police report confirmed it. The driver admitted it. I was not at fault. You were arguing with her, Robert insisted. Her friend told us. She called Cassie right before you left the party. Cassie was upset. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Yes, we had disagreed about wedding plans. It was a minor squabble that wouldn't have mattered the next day. But there was no shouting in the car, no distraction. I was watching the road when that truck came out of nowhere. Pastor James observed the exchange carefully. Grief had clearly distorted Robert's perception of events, while guilt survivors' guilt, if nothing else, had driven Michael to extreme measures. And caught in the middle was Emily, who had done nothing wrong except fall in love with a man who hadn't been fully honest. Mr. Bennett, the pastor said gently, would you say that before the accident, Michael was good to your daughter? Did he love her? The question seemed to catch Robert off guard. After a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. Yes, he made her happy. Until he killed her. He didn't kill her, Emily said suddenly, surprising everyone. A reckless driver did. The police confirmed it. She turned to Michael. Isn't that right? Yes, Michael whispered. But that didn't stop the blame. After the funeral, when Mr. Bennett threatened me, I was out of my mind with grief, Robert interrupted defensively. And when friends stopped calling, clients left, and the whispers followed me everywhere, I broke. I couldn't be Michael Reeves anymore. So I disappeared, changed my name legally, moved somewhere no one knew me. He looked directly at Emily. And then I met you, and for the first time in years, I felt hope again. Silence fell over the room. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud. Outside, they could hear occasional murmurs from the increasingly restless congregation. Emily stood and walked to the window, her back to the others. The white dress she'd chosen so carefully now seemed to represent a different kind of purity, not the traditional symbolism, but the clean slate she was being asked to consider. I need to know one thing, she said finally, turning around. Did you ever intend to tell me the truth? Michael stood as well, maintaining a respectful distance. Yes. After the wedding, on our honeymoon, I had it all planned how I would explain, how I would show you that Adam Wells wasn't a complete fabrication, but the person I become, the person who loves you. That's convenient timing, Robert scoffed. It's the truth, Michael insisted. I have the newspaper articles, the police reports, everything saved on my laptop. I was going to show you all of it, Emily. Pastor James cleared his throat. We need to make a decision about what happens next. There are people waiting. Emily nodded slowly. Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming today. I'm truly sorry for your loss. Her voice was gentle but firm. But I need to speak with my fiancé alone. Robert looked like he wanted to object, but something in Emily's composed demeanor stopped him. He nodded curtly and left the room, followed by Pastor James, who gave Emily's shoulder a reassuring squeeze as he passed. When the door closed, Emily and Michael faced each other across the small office, she in her wedding gown, he in his tuxedo, the trappings of a celebration now overshadowed by revealed secrets. The guests had been sent home with a brief explanation that the wedding was postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. Most left confused, some speculating wildly about what could have happened. Emily's father, after hearing a condensed version of the situation, had taken charge of thanking people for coming and ensuring the reception food wouldn't go to waste. It would be donated to a local shelter. In the now empty church, Emily sat in the front pew, still in her wedding dress. She'd removed her veil, and her carefully styled hair was coming undone. Beside her sat Michael, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. I keep thinking about what my life would have been like if Pastor James hadn't recognized you, Emily said softly. If we had exchanged vows, started our marriage with this massive secret between us. Michael stared at his hands. I've imagined telling you 1,000 different ways over the past months. Each time, I convinced myself it would be better to wait a little longer, that I needed you to know me the real me first. But I didn't know the real you, Emily countered. I knew a version with missing pieces. The important parts were true, Michael insisted. How I feel about you, my values, the future I want, those aren't lies. Emily shook her head. You don't understand. Trust isn't just about the big things. It's built on a foundation of complete honesty, especially about the difficult parts of ourselves. Pastor James approached from the side aisle, having given him space to talk. He carried 3 cups of coffee from the church kitchen. Thought you might need this, he said, offering them the steaming mugs. Thank you, Emily said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. For everything today. The pastor sat in the pew behind them. I've seen many couples face challenges, he said gently, though admittedly none quite like this. What matters now is how you move forward from here. The weeks following what should have been their wedding day were the hardest Emily had ever experienced. She moved back into her father's house temporarily, unable to face the apartment she had begun to share with Michael. Each morning she woke with the same hollow feeling in her chest, a mixture of grief for what she'd lost and anger at the deception. Friends called constantly, their concern genuine but their curiosity palpable. Emily told him only that she and Adam Michael had discovered fundamental differences that couldn't be reconciled. Only Melissa knew the full truth, providing a shoulder to cry on during the darkest nights when Emily questioned her own judgment. "I'm a nurse," Emily said during one such evening, tears streaming down her face. "I'm supposed to be good at reading people, at understanding them. How did I miss something this huge?" "Because he didn't want you to see it," Melissa replied, stroking her friend's hair. "And because what you did see is kindness, his love for you that was real." Michael, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. The carefully constructed life he'd built as Adam Wells was unraveling. Colleagues at work grew distant as rumors spread. His landlord, a friend of Emily's family, suggested he might want to find another place to live when his lease ended. During a particularly low moment, he found himself parked outside Robert Bennett's hotel. For an hour he sat there, gathering courage, before finally knocking on the older man's door. The conversation was painful, raw, and long overdue. There were harsh words and painful accusations, but also, finally, a measure of understanding. Neither man left fully healed, but both felt the first stirrings of acceptance Robert that Michael truly hadn't been at fault for the accident, and Michael that running from his past had only compounded his suffering. 2 months after the aborted wedding, Pastor James received a call from Emily. She asked if they could meet. When she arrived at his office, she looked different, thinner, perhaps, but with a new steadiness in her eyes. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," she said. "Not just forgiving Michael, but understanding why he felt he needed to become someone else." "And what have you concluded?" the pastor asked. "That trauma changes us all," Emily replied. "Some of us become stronger in the broken places. Others try to erase the breaks entirely. Neither is entirely right or wrong, just different responses to pain." Emily had begun therapy, working through her feelings of betrayal and examining her own tendency to look for people who needed fixing. Michael, too, had started counseling, confronting the grief and guilt he'd been running from for years. They met occasionally, at first with Pastor James present as a mediator, later on their own. Their conversations were careful, honest, sometimes painful. There were no promises of reconciliation, no guarantee that trust once broken could be fully restored. But there was growth. Michael legally reclaimed his birth name, while acknowledging that parts of Adam Wells the man he'd become through healing were worth preserving. Emily learned to listen to her instincts more carefully, while not closing her heart to the possibility of love. 3 months after what should have been their wedding day, Emily visited Cassandra's grave with Michael. They stood side by side, not touching, as he finally allowed himself to properly mourn the woman he had loved and lost. Emily placed flowers on a headstone, acknowledging a life she had never known but that had profoundly shaped her own journey. "Thank you for coming," Michael said as they walked back to their separate cars. "I needed to understand all of you," Emily replied, "even the parts that hurt to see." It wasn't an ending or a beginning, just another step in a complicated healing process that neither of them could have anticipated when they first met on that rainy day outside the hospital. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Pastor James stood at the altar of his church once again. The sanctuary was different this time, simpler decorations, fewer guests, but somehow the atmosphere felt more genuine. Emily stood before him in a cream-colored dress, elegant but understated, her hair loosed around her shoulders. Beside her stood Michael Reeves, his real name now used openly, his past no longer a secret to be hidden, but a chapter in a longer story. Robert Bennett sat in the front row, his expression complex but no longer hostile. Emily's father sat on the opposite side, watchful but supportive. This wasn't a wedding. It was a commitment ceremony of a different kind of pledge to continue the journey of healing and honesty they had begun. After months of careful rebuilding, Emily and Michael had decided not to rush back into the relationship they'd once had, but rather to acknowledge the new one they were slowly creating. "Today," Pastor James addressed a small gathering, "we witness not the beginning of marriage, but the celebration of profound truth these two had discovered. That authentic love can only grow in the soil of complete honesty, that our past shape but need not define us, and that some journeys take unexpected turns before reaching their destination." Emily and Michael had each written personal vows, not promises of forever, but commitments to continued truth and growth. Michael spoke of his journey from running away to standing still, from hiding to revealing. Emily spoke of forgiveness not as forgetting, but as choosing to see the whole person, flaws and all. After the ceremony, at the small reception in the church hall, Robert Bennett approached Pastor James. "I didn't think I could ever be in the same room with him without anger," the older man confessed. "But watching him these past months, how he's faced his past, how he's tried to make amends, it's helped me see that holding on to my rage wasn't bringing Cassie back. It was just keeping me from moving forward." Across the room, Emily's father shook Michael's hand not with the enthusiasm he might have shown a year earlier, but with cautious respect for the difficult road the younger man had traveled. Melissa, who had stood by Emily through the darkest days, raised her glass in a toast. "To truth," she said simply. "However messy, however painful, it's the only foundation strong enough to build a life on." Later that evening, as the small gathering dispersed, Pastor James found himself alone in the sanctuary, reflecting on the year's events. He thought of how close Emily had come to marrying a man with a hidden past, how his moment of recognition had altered multiple lives. Not for the first time, he felt humbled by the responsibility his position carried. The moral of their story wasn't simple. It wasn't that secrets always come to light, though often they do. It wasn't that forgiveness heals all wounds, though it can begin the healing process. Perhaps, he thought, it was that authentic love requires authentic selves, that we cannot truly be loved if we are not truly known. 3 years later, Pastor James would officiate at another ceremony in the same church, a proper wedding this time, between Emily and Michael. By then, Michael had reclaimed his career under his real name. Emily had advanced to head nurse in the pediatric ward. Robert Bennett would walk her down the aisle alongside her father, a gesture of healing that few could have imagined possible. But that was still to come. For now, in this moment of reflection, Pastor James was simply grateful for the strange twist of fate or divine intervention that had allowed him to recognize the groom that day, setting in motion a journey toward truth that, while painful, had ultimately led to something genuine and deeply real. Addressing the audience directly, life doesn't always unfold the way we expect it to, does it? Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest challenges. Sometimes the wedding that doesn't happen leads to the relationship that should. What secrets are you carrying that might be holding you back from authentic connection? What truth are you avoiding that might ultimately set you free? These are questions worth asking ourselves, not just once, but throughout our lives.